It was 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve when my half-brother poured boiling water on my hands. Not accidentally. Not in a fit of rage he couldn't control. Deliberately. Calmly. The way you'd water a plant. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the dinner dishes, and he walked up behind me without a word, lifted the electric kettle from the counter, and tilted it. The scream that tore out of me was so raw, it didn't even sound human. My palms went white, then pink, then an angry swollen red, the skin already beginning to pucker at the edges. I spun around, my hands shaking, held out in front of me like evidence I was too shocked to process. My stepfather was in the doorway. He'd heard me scream. He looked at my hands, then at my half-brother, then back at me, and he said, "What did you do to provoke him this time?" I want you to sit with that for a second. My hands were scalded. My half-brother was standing there holding a kettle, and my stepfather's first question was what I had done to deserve it. That was the moment I stopped being a daughter in that house. Right there, at the kitchen sink on Christmas Eve, with the smell of burnt skin and dishwater in the air. Something in me went very, very quiet. And that quiet, that's where the story really begins. My name is Sloan. I'm a registered nurse, and I have been for the past 4 years. I work nights at a level 2 trauma center outside of Columbus, Ohio. I am 29 years old. I own my apartment, I pay my own bills, and I have built a life that is mine in every way that counts. But none of that was true 3 years ago, when I was still tangled up in the worst mistake I had ever made, going back to that house. Let me back up. My mother died when I was 11. A brain aneurysm, fast and without warning, the kind that gives you no time to prepare and no one to blame. One morning, she was making coffee, and by afternoon, she was gone. My father, my biological father, was a quiet, gentle man who worked at a printing press and read paperback westerns on the weekends. He tried. He really did. But grief does strange things to people, and 2 years after my mother died, he met a woman named Renata at his church's grief support group. They got married 14 months later. Renata came with a son. His name was Cole. He was 16 when they married, 5 years older than me, and from the first week he moved into our house, he made it clear that he saw me as an obstacle. Not a sister, not even a rival, just something in his way. He would eat the food I'd set aside in the fridge and deny it to my father's face. He would make plans that included everyone except me, and then act baffled when I felt excluded. He borrowed my bicycle once and returned it with a bent wheel and a shrug. They were small things. Individually, each one was small enough that when I brought them to my father, he'd look at me with that tired, hollowed-out expression and say some version of, "Can you just try to get along for me?" So I tried. For years, I tried. The trying got harder when I was 15 and my father's heart gave out. A cardiac event set in on a Tuesday afternoon. And just like that, I was an orphan living in a house that belonged to Renata, sleeping in a bedroom that Renata was already mentally converting into a craft room, dependent on a woman who had never pretended to love me, and a stepbrother who had never pretended to tolerate me. I won't romanticize what that period was. It was survival. I kept my grades up because a full scholarship was the only exit I could see. I worked weekends at a diner. I stayed out of Cole's way. I counted down. When I got into the nursing program at Ohio State, I didn't celebrate in that house. I drove to the parking lot of the Kroger 2 miles away and sat in my car and cried with relief until my ribs hurt. I was free. Or I thought I was. The thing about thinking you're free is that the past has a way of making you prove it. I graduated, passed my boards, got my job. 3 years went by. 3 good, quiet years where I rebuilt myself from scratch. Learned who I was when nobody was undermining me. Learned that my instincts were sharp and my judgment was sound. Learned that I was actually genuinely good at something. Nursing suited me the way very few things in life suit a person. I understood how to be present in a crisis. I understood how to stay calm when everything around you was falling apart. I thought I had drawn a clear line between my past and my present. Then, the August before last, I got a phone call. It was Renata. Her voice was soft and careful in a way that immediately made the back of my neck prickle. She said she'd been thinking about me. She said she was proud of everything I'd accomplished. She said that family was important and that she hoped I hadn't let our rough patches color my view of her forever. I almost hung up. I should have. But she said one sentence that stopped me cold. Your father's family has been asking about his personal effects, and there are some things that legally belong to you. My father. His things. A box in storage, she said, with letters and photographs and his old watch, the one his own father had given him. Small things. Mine by right. I drove out to Millbrook, the suburb outside of Columbus where Renata and Cole still lived in the house I grew up in, on a Friday afternoon in late September. I told myself it was one trip, in and out. I'd take the box and leave and never think about any of them again. I don't know how to explain what happened next without it sounding like weakness. So I'll just tell it plain. When I got there, Renata had cooked dinner. She'd made pot roast, my father's favorite. The house smelled warm. She hugged me at the door with what felt like genuine relief. She showed me the box. It was real. It was there. It had the watch and the letters and a photograph of my parents at the beach before I was born. She cried a little. She said she'd been wrong to shut me out after my father died. She said she wanted to do better, and I, who had spent 3 years becoming someone who trusted her own instincts, sat down at that kitchen table and stayed for dinner. I was there for a long weekend, then another. By November, I was coming back most weekends. I told myself it was for the closure. Maybe it was. Maybe it was also just the oldest hunger in the world, the hunger to be someone's family again. Cole was civil at first. Not warm, not welcoming, but civil. He'd nod at me when I came in. He'd pass things at the dinner table without being asked. He'd made something of himself, or so it appeared on the surface. He worked in sales, drove a decent truck, kept a girlfriend named Penny who seemed nervous in a way I couldn't quite name. I noticed things, but I filed them away. The way Cole's eyes would track me across the room. The way he and Renata would sometimes stop talking when I walked in. The way certain questions Renata asked me about my salary, my apartment, my savings, felt less like interest and more like inventory. I filed it away. I didn't want to be the person who walked into a second chance and poisoned it with old suspicion. The financial talk started in October. Renata mentioned, almost casually, over her second glass of wine, that Cole had gotten himself into a difficult situation. She was vague at first. Legal fees, she said. Some kind of dispute with a former business partner. Nothing criminal, she assured me, just expensive. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you need something, but haven't gotten to the asking part yet. I said I was sorry to hear it. She said she knew I'd done well for myself. She said family helped each other. She said she didn't want to put pressure on me, but if I had anything I could spare, even a loan, it would mean the world. I told her I'd think about it. That was the version she showed me on the surface. What I found out later, by accident, while looking for a phone charger in the drawer of Renata's home office, was the version underneath. A letter from a collections agency. A second one from an attorney representing a man named whoever, I barely registered the name, to whom Cole apparently owed $18,000 from what was described as a failed real estate investment. A third letter, this one from their mortgage servicer, outlining a 30-day notice for missed payments. They weren't in a difficult situation. They were underwater, and they had been working me patiently and methodically for months. I stood in that room with the letters in my hand and felt the particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. It starts in your sternum and moves outward. It's the cold of recognizing that something you thought was a second chance was actually a setup. I put the letters back exactly where I'd found them. I walked back to the living room and sat down with my cup of coffee, and I did not let my face change. Not yet. That night, I drove back to Columbus and called my best friend from nursing school, a woman named Priya, who had walked me through more hospital crises than either of us could count. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I was done, she said, "You need to talk to someone who does elder and family law. Tomorrow." I did. The attorney's name was James Fowler. He worked out of a small office in a converted Victorian near the Short North, the kind of office that smells like old carpet and strong coffee and feels like someone actually uses it. He was in his mid-50s, methodical, and he had kind of hawk-like economy of expression that made me feel like nothing I said was going to surprise him. I told him everything. The years of estrangement, the phone call from Renata, the weekend visits, the requests for money, the letters I'd found. He listened. He asked precise questions. He did not offer sympathy, which I didn't need, and he did not waste my time, which I did not have. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and said, "Do you have any of this documented?" I thought about that. I had some texts from Renata. I had voicemails. What I didn't have was the conversation in October, the one about Cole's legal troubles and the loan request, because I hadn't thought to record it. He said, "Start now. Document everything going forward. Date, time, what was said, who was present. Save every text, every email. If they ask you for money again, I want it in writing." He paused. "And do not give them anything." I went back to Millbrook the following weekend. I went back because leaving abruptly would tip them off, and because James Fowler had told me that if they were going to come after me for anything, I needed to understand the full shape of what they were planning. So I went back, and I smiled, and I was warm, and I listened, and I documented everything. Cole was different that weekend. The civility had thinned. He was home both days, which was unusual, and he watched me in a way that had stopped being subtle. Sunday afternoon, when Renata went to the grocery store and left us alone in the house, he came into the kitchen, where I was reading at the table, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He said, "You're not going to help us, are you?" I looked up from my book. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've got that same face you used to have when you were pretending to think about something you'd already decided." He pushed off the door frame and walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a beer. "You always thought you were smarter than everybody in this house." I kept my voice even. I said I'd think about it. He popped the cap and looked at me over the rim of the bottle. "You know what your problem is? You act like you don't owe us anything." "I'm not sure what I'd owe you, Cole." Something flickered across his face. Not anger, exactly. Something colder, more considered. "Renata raised you. After your dad died, she kept this house. She kept you in it. You think that doesn't come with some kind of obligation?" I said. He didn't answer. He just looked at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the living room. I picked up my phone. I opened the voice memo app and pressed record. I slipped it back into my pocket. He came back in 10 minutes later, and the conversation that followed, the one where he told me explicitly that if I didn't help with the debt, he would tell people things about me, things about my past, things that would make the hospital look at me differently. I got all of it. I didn't react. I kept my voice level, and I asked him to clarify what he meant, which made him say it more explicitly, which made it more useful. It was one of the most frightening conversations I've had, not because of what he was threatening, but because of how calm he was while he was threatening it. When I left that afternoon, I called James Fowler from the car. The last weekend I went back, I almost didn't. It was December, the Christmas visit, and Renata had made it sentimental. She mentioned the holiday decorations my father had always put up, the ornaments my mother had collected, the ones that were technically mine, and that she had apparently kept in a box in the attic this whole time. She said she'd gotten them out. She said it would be nice to put them up together. That was what got me through the door. My mother's ornaments, I had them in my bag before dinner. Small glass globes and painted birds, the kind you can't replace. My mother had bought them at craft fairs and antique stores over the course of her whole adult life, every one of them with a story she told me when I was small. I had them. That was the only good thing about that night. The evening went wrong in the kitchen. Cole had been drinking since before I arrived. I could tell by the looseness around his eyes, the slight over-precision of his movements. Renata was performing normalcy with the focused effort of a stage actress. We had dinner. It was tense and careful and exhausting. Afterward, I was at the sink. Cole came up behind me, and then the kettle. I've described what happened already. I don't need to describe it again. What I will tell you is what happened next. The part the original story I was given no one answered. I stood there with my scalded hands under the cold tap, and I looked at my stepfather. Except I don't have a stepfather. I need to be precise here. I looked at Renata, who had come into the kitchen, who looked at my hands and looked at her son, and who said in a voice so mild it was obscene, "Let's not make this bigger than it is." I turned off the tap. I picked up my bag from the kitchen chair with my forearms because I couldn't grip properly. I walked out the front door without another word. In the driveway, I sat in my car with the heat on and my hands palm up in my lap, and I called Priya. She stayed on the phone with me the entire 40-minute drive back to Columbus, talking me through the adrenaline, telling me to keep breathing, repeating every few minutes, "You're out. You're driving away. You're out." I went to the urgent care clinic near my apartment. Second-degree scalding to both palms, partial thickness. They documented it. Photographs, medical record, the works. The PA who treated me looked at the injury and looked at me and asked quietly how it had happened. I told him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to want this on record." I already knew that, but hearing someone else say it made it real in a different way. The next morning, I was back in James Fowler's office with photographs of my hands, an urgent care report, a voice recording of Cole's threats, and 3 months of documented text messages. He looked at everything slowly and carefully. When he was finished, he took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk and said, "This is assault. The rest of it constitutes criminal threatening. This isn't just a civil matter anymore." He walked me through the options. We could pursue criminal charges. And, given the documentation, he thought there was a solid case. We could also pursue a civil protective order, which would be faster. We could do both. But he had an idea about the civil piece that he wanted to walk me through. He said, "They want money. The only leverage they have left to try to get it is the threat Cole made on the recording, the threat to damage your professional reputation. That's extortion. And extortion, once documented, tends to make people very cooperative about signing things." The plan he outlined was measured and methodical. I would contact Renata and tell her I'd reconsidered. I would tell her I was prepared to discuss a financial arrangement. I would suggest we meet at Fowler's office to go over the paperwork, framed as a requirement from my financial advisor. She would not question it, he said, because greed is reliable. She didn't question it. They came in on a gray Tuesday in January, Renata in her good coat, Cole in what looked like a job interview shirt. They were performing optimism. Cole was scrolling his phone with barely concealed impatience, already somewhere else, already spending. I was already in the room when they arrived. I was wearing my scrubs because I'd come from a shift and I hadn't gone home to change, and I remember thinking that maybe that was actually right, that I should be exactly who I was. No performance, no costume, just me. James Fowler greeted them professionally and invited them to sit. In the corner of the room, quiet and not immediately obvious, was a Columbus police detective named Susan Park, who had been briefed on the extortion recording and the assault. Beside the window stood my neighbor from the urgent care clinic. Not the PA who had treated me, but the clinic director, whom Priya happened to know, who had reviewed my file and was prepared to testify to the nature and origin of the injury. Fowler opened a folder. He said he'd like to review a few things before they got to the paperwork. He played the recording first. The quality was good. Cole's voice was unhurried and specific, every word of it precise and damning. Renata's hand went to her throat. Cole went very still. Then Fowler laid out the photographs of my hands, the urgent care report, the collections letters, and the mortgage default notice, copies obtained through proper channels. The story he told with those documents was calm and factual and complete. It had no gaps. Cole stood up. His voice was controlled, but there was something fraying underneath it. He said it was all taken out of context, that he'd been under stress, that nothing he'd said was a real threat. Detective Park stood up. She didn't have to say much, just that she'd reviewed the recording and the medical documentation, and that given what she'd seen, she was prepared to proceed with charges unless all parties reached an agreement this afternoon. Cole sat back down. Fowler slid 2 documents across the table. The first was a no-contact order. Renata and Cole would have no further communication with me, by any means, for any reason, effective immediately. The second was a deed transfer. The house, which had originally been purchased jointly by my father and Renata, and which, under Ohio law, had an arguable claim given my father's estate was never formally settled, would be signed over to me. Renata and Cole would vacate within 60 days. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal charges. Option 2, Fowler said, was that he would walk the recording and the medical report to the prosecutor's office that afternoon, and they could take their chances in court. The room was very quiet. Renata signed first. Her hand was shaking. Cole signed without looking at me. I sat there while it happened, and I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was closer to exhaustion, the deep cellular kind that comes after a long time of being on high alert. The fight-or-flight chemistry that had been in my bloodstream for months was slowly, carefully releasing its grip. I drove home in the late afternoon light, the January sun flat and low over the highway, and I called Priya. "It's done," I said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come over. I'm making soup." The 60 days passed. I didn't go back to Millbrook until they were gone. When I did, a friend from work and her husband came with me, and we walked through the rooms while she made notes about what needed to be repaired, and he started in immediately on a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, because he's the kind of person who can't walk past a leaky faucet without fixing it, and that specifically made me want to cry in the best possible way. The house was different without their presence filling it. Smaller maybe, or just honest about its size. Some of the furniture was gone. They had taken Renata's curated pieces, her matching lamps, her accent chairs. What remained were the bones, the hardwood floors my father had refinished himself the summer before he died, the window seat in the living room where I used to read when I was 10, the apple tree in the backyard that was bare and gray in February, but that I knew would bloom again in April. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. There was still a mark on the counter from where my father used to set his coffee mug every morning, a faint ring worn into the laminate from years of the same small habit. I pressed my fingertips to it, my palms still tender at the edges, and I thought about the kind of permanence that doesn't announce itself. A week later, I found a box my father had left in the attic crawlspace that Renata apparently hadn't found or hadn't thought to take. It had his handwriting on the side in black marker, slow A-N-E. My name. Things he'd been saving for me, my mother's jewelry, my grandmother's recipe cards, a letter he'd started and never finished, the first 2 lines of which read, "I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to start saying it. I am proud of you in ways I was never good at telling you." I sat on the attic floor and read it 3 times. I won't pretend the healing was fast. It wasn't. It came in the ordinary way. Healing comes slowly and sideways, in the middle of other things. A good shift at work. Priya's soup. Learning that the apple tree did in fact bloom in April, huge and pink, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened under its branches. Teaching myself to repot plants. Painting the bedroom the color I had always wanted it and never been allowed to choose. I joined a support group for adult survivors of family abuse. Not because someone told me to, but because I Googled it at 11 o'clock one night when I couldn't sleep and found a meeting 2 miles from my apartment on Thursday evenings. I went the first time planning to say nothing and ending up talking for 45 minutes. The woman who ran it, whose name was Dr. Renee Castillo, looked at me afterward and said, "You've been carrying this a long time." "Yes," I said. "You can put some of it down now. I'm still working on that. Some days are easier than others. But I have found that the act of speaking clearly about what happened, not with drama, not with bitterness, but with precise and honest language, does something that silence never could. It makes the thing real and also, somehow, smaller. Like it has edges now. Like it can be looked at from outside. I still work nights. I still drive home in the early morning when the highways are empty and the light is starting to go gray-pink over the east side of the city. I still live in my apartment most of the week, though I spend weekends now in Millbrook, in the house with the apple tree, slowly making it into something that feels like mine. My mother's ornaments are on the windowsill in the kitchen. Not on a tree. I haven't felt ready to do a tree yet, but on the sill, where the light comes through in the afternoon and turns the painted glass birds into something luminous. I look at my hands sometimes. The scars have faded to thin silver lines across both palms, easy to miss unless you know to look. My colleagues at work don't know the story. My patients certainly don't. But in the particular intimacy of holding someone's hand during a hard moment, which is something nurses do more than most people realize, I am always aware of them. They remind me that I stayed too long, but that I left. That I was manipulated, but that I saw through it. That I was hurt, but that I healed. That I documented and I waited, and I did not let them make me into the version of myself they needed me to be. If you are in a house where the people who are supposed to protect you look at your injury and ask what you did to deserve it, I need you to hear this. That question is not about you. It has never been about you. It is about their inability to be what you need. And you do not have to stay in a room where that is the only answer they have. Your signal matters. Send it. Someone will hear it. To every person watching this who has ever been told that their pain was an inconvenience, I see you. And I want you to know that the quiet thing that forms in you when you stop trying to earn your place in a room that was never really yours, that quiet is not defeat. That quiet is where you finally begin. There's a mark on the kitchen counter in that house, a faint ring worn into the laminate from years of my father setting his coffee mug in the same spot every single morning. I press my fingertips to it sometimes, my palms still carrying their silver lines, and I think about what it means that the most permanent things in a life are rarely the ones that announce themselves. Cole poured that water because he believed on some level that I could be made small enough to stop mattering. Renata smiled because she had spent years practicing the particular skill of looking past inconvenient truths. And for a long time, I let them. Not because I was foolish. I need to be honest about that with myself. But because the hunger to belong somewhere, to be claimed by someone after losing both parents, is one of the most powerful forces a person can carry. They used that hunger like a tool. They knew exactly where to press. What I understand now, sitting in the kitchen with my mother's painted glass birds on the windowsill and the apple tree going pink outside, is that what finally saved me? Was not anger. Anger was there, yes, and it was useful in its way. But anger without clarity is just noise. What actually turned the tide was the decision to start treating my own experience as something worth documenting. James Fowler called it evidence. But what it really was, in the most fundamental sense, was me deciding that what had happened to me was real, and that real things deserve to be taken seriously. That decision, to look clearly at what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening, is harder than it sounds. It requires a kind of intellectual honesty that people in pain don't always have access to. Because pain distorts the lens. It makes you want to explain things away, to give benefit of the doubt long past the point where doubt has earned any benefit. I did that for months. I sat across from Renata at that dinner table and filed away the things I noticed. The inventory-style questions about my salary, the careful performances of warmth, and I chose not to look directly at them, because looking directly meant acknowledging that I had walked back into something I should have stayed out of. The honesty was what made everything else possible. Once I saw clearly, I could think clearly. Once I could think clearly, I could act strategically. And once I acted strategically, I stopped being someone. Things were happening to and became someone making deliberate choices about her own life. I think about Priya telling me to keep breathing on that 40-minute drive. I think about the PA at urgent care who looked at my hands and said quietly that I would want this on record. Not because he was required to say it, but because he was decent, and decency is its own kind of courage. I think about Dr. Courage, Castillo in that Thursday evening meeting telling me I could put some of it down now. The people who helped me were not dramatic about it. They were just present and steady, and they believed me without requiring me to perform my pain at a particular volume. That is what I try to carry forward. Not the story of what was done to me, but the evidence of what I did in response. I gathered information when I was afraid. I held my face still when everything in me was shaking. I walked into that lawyer's office, and I trusted the process even when trusting felt like the most vulnerable thing I had ever done. I chose not to let them make me into someone who burns things down rather than building something better from the wreckage. The scars on my palms will always be there. I don't cover them. I don't explain them to people who don't ask. But in the particular quiet of holding someone's hand through a hard night at the hospital, I am always aware of them, and they remind me, every time, that surviving something is not the same as being defined by it. You get to decide what it means. That is the only power no one can take from you, no matter how long they try.